After the way the last episode ended, this episode had a lot of heavy lifting to do in order to get us to a point where the finale next week could sufficiently wrap the season up. While I wasn't ecstatic about some of the decisions made in the episode while watching it through the first time, having the time to look back on it as a whole afterward makes me like what we got more. After the cliffhanger that ended last episode, I was very curious to see how this episode picked up. We start off with Loki in the abandoned TVA, and for a bit he's just searching around desperately, looking for any clue or sign of hope that makes what he witnessed any easier to comprehend. He's about as confused as we are. And it doesn't help that he's time-slipping again, which still looks just as painful as before. He runs into another Loki in the TVA, and initially I assumed this was just another timeline version of him, suggesting that we may get to see a point similar to Season 1, where there are just a bunch of Lokis running around working together to solve the problem. But rather, this is a little more comedic than that, as it's a future version of himself that he almost immediately finds himself in the shoes of. This opening scene was very quiet and suspenseful, a slow build coming off of the cliffhanger. Personally, I didn't love how long it took for us to start getting some answers and actually make some headway in the grand story. Even as he's time-slipping across timelines running into his friends from the TVA, it felt more like a checklist that we had to mark off every time we found somebody we knew in their real life, and not like it was actually leading somewhere. It felt like we were just treading in water with all of these conversations, waiting for something big to happen. I think the first half of the episode would have flowed much better if these past two episodes were seen back to back. Coming off the big climactic ending of episode 4 with the cliffhanger, this episode starting off a bit slower would have been a nice way to process everything and settle down a bit. But we've already had a week to do that between episodes, so once I get back into the next episode, I'm hoping that we start to ramp things up immediately again. Part of that I think is a lack of patience on my end, but I do think the episode could have been paced better, at least the first half. The TVA starts to break down around Loki, and then we get to meet up with the entire group of characters as they live out their lives we assume they were taken from. Loki finds Casey as a prisoner named Frank, escaping from Alcatraz in a 1962 branched timeline, and then he slips rapidly across various places, going from McDonald's to a jet ski store, and then the TVA Time Theater. The Time Theater interests me a bit. I'm wondering if there's any meaning behind that one. But with how the other two were done so quickly, it felt like a cheap tease at Sylvie and Mobius. After already seeing Casey, I figured we'd be going across timelines, seeing what happened to everyone and where they're off to, so I don't think this was necessary to include. We briefly catch up with B-15 on a branched timeline in 2012 New York. However, she's only left horrified as she briefly sees Loki slip in and out. He quickly arrives in 2012 Cleveland, Ohio, where he meets jet ski salesman Don, who we know as Mobius. But there isn't much of substance until 1994 Pasadena, where we meet Obi, a struggling science fiction author who's willing to buy his own books at a store to feel good about himself. There are a few solid comedic moments here or there with Loki's conversation with him, but I was in somewhat disbelief about how easily he took all of the information Loki gave him in stride. It didn't happen on screen, but based on the conversation we can assume Loki filled him in on a good portion of it all. We've already seen Obi to be somewhat trusting in others and what they tell him, and a background in theoretical physics helps, but it didn't feel like he questioned the TVA or time-slipping or anything like all of that at all. Almost like he was the same character we had known before. I just don't think I enjoyed how in stride he took all of this. Obi does his best to try and help Loki control the time-slipping, getting him to focus in on the why, which Loki claims is saving the TVA, but I think it was fairly obvious that he was lying to himself. No matter what he says or does, I don't think Loki truly believes in the TVA. It's just that it appears that way in comparison to Sylvie's extreme opinion on the contrary. While I didn't enjoy everything about this episode, it did a lot to focus in on Loki's character and his arc. I'm skipping towards the end a bit here, but there was a lot of characterization for Loki towards the end, between his conversation with Sylvie at the bar and the final scene of the episode. Before he was brought into the TVA, Loki was a villain. He didn't have people in his corner, he didn't have friends or a purpose, a reason to be better. When you have people in your life that make you want to be better, it's a special feeling, so I don't blame Loki for going through all of this to get his friends back. And he's finally able to admit that to Sylvie at the bar. It's a sad moment for him, because it's a moment that humanizes him. The last episode put Loki and Sylvie on pedestals, reminding us of how powerful they are. They got their powers back in the TVA, and they had that conversation about playing God in all of these people's lives. But now they appear no different than the rest of us. People who want a place to belong. The character work in the series has been nothing short of amazing. Loki's left to find his own story, but after being able to suddenly control his time-slipping, he realizes that it's about who. I guess it was the thought of losing Sylvie and the others close to him that finally made him be able to do it. This episode was really all about Loki having the confidence in himself to make his own story, and coming to terms with who he is. He's able to admit that he cares about these other people, and then he needs them to feel good about himself. But going back to earlier in the episode, Obi is able to come up with some sort of plan about getting everyone back together to have the same temporal aura as before the loom collapsed. And just when things started to finally make sense to me, they throw it all away, at least briefly. Loki giving Obi the handbook allows for him to build a hodgepodge temp pad, allowing them to bring the band back together again. The portals made by that thing definitely didn't look stable, so I wouldn't have been surprised if something went wrong there, but I don't think that'll play a role in the finale. Loki time slips away to Mobius, where we get to see him as a single dad, and life is not easy. But he still loves his son, and his job is a jet ski salesman. It's all he knows in this life. So that makes it so much more emotional when Loki comes in and tries telling him about his real life, a moment that reminded me a lot of WandaVision. Mobius has the struggle of leaving his sons behind, and having the knowledge that he did so, even if they won't, but Loki mentioning the danger they're in is enough to convince him to come. Although the music hasn't stood out to me all that much this season, this was a moment where I really felt its impact. There's a short montage of Loki going out to get B-15 and Casey, and I'll admit it seemed pretty badass with the music and lighting and the way it was all shot. The last person he goes to is Sylvie, who is back at her life at McDonald's. She hasn't forgotten anything of what happened, which really brings the question up of what the difference does being a god make in this situation here. Neither of them forgot what happened, but Sylvie was sent back to her life on Earth, while Loki was still in the TVA. Loki is back to time slipping whereas nobody else is, and although it appeared at first that neither one of them was able to disappear with her timeline, Sylvie did eventually disappear at the end, while it didn't look like Loki was. So although I don't think there's any clear contradictions here, it would be nice if they explained this all a bit. But then again, leaving it open-ended gives them more freedom in the future, which I think is the better option. The two of them go to the bar after Sylvie sees Loki time slip. I loved her reaction to that. And although I already briefly went over the scene, the argument here over choice and free will is one I want to dive into a bit, because Sylvie wanting all of the TVA workers to be sent back to their real lives without a say in the matter is basically the same as He Who Remains, but the opposite direction. You're forcing people into a role without them being able to make the decision for themselves. It was never brought up, but Sylvie is behaving very similarly to He Who Remains. We later return to Sylvie as she enters a record shop, and it wasn't until here that I remembered the meal disappearing when we first saw her after work. She's not going to get her happily ever after, because her timeline is dying too. The diegetic music was nice as the world starts to disappear behind her, and the visuals here were insane. This may have been one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, with Sylvie listening to the music, the world falling apart behind her, and just the way some of it was shot. It captured the horror of it, but also the beauty, and then it just ends with emptiness. She uses her portal to meet up with Loki and the gang, and I was expecting for her to have a little more of a reaction given that her timeline and everything she had grown so close to was gone. She literally saw it die right in front of her. This part of the episode was a little odd to me, because it felt like there was a very instantaneous and massive change in emotion as the episode becomes very positive and hopeful for a short minute, and then it immediately goes back as the timeline starts to die around them. We've got the whole thing with Loki time slipping back to before it happens, talked a bit about that before, and then the episode ends with him going back in time to before the loom collapses. So the finale will pick back up somewhere in episode 4, but we can assume Loki is going to influence events to play out differently. I believe Miss Minutes and Renslayer will still be gone at this point, but Victor Timely should still be alive, which will more than likely be an important part of the episode. What did you think of this Loki episode? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like the video, and subscribe for coverage of Loki as a new episode premieres every week, and remember to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Thank you all for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you. Always.